Okay. Here we go. Excellent. Okay. Well, good afternoon or good evening, or actually good, I think it's morning, late morning in Australia. So depending upon where you are, this is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And it's always a treat to see Michael Robotham here with us, albeit virtually, to discuss his brand new book, When You Are Mine. Got a copy right here. And let's see, what can I say, Barbara? The usual, my spiel. If you have questions for Michael as they occur to you throughout the hour, go ahead and put them in the comments or the chats feature, and Barbara will summon me back on screen. And towards the end of the hour, I'll be happy to ask any of your questions. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Michael, what a pleasure to see you. I've learned from a little research I did today that you are joining us in what your children refer to as your cabana of cruelty.
I used to in our previous house I had a basement office which they referred to as Dad's Pit of Despair, and in this new house they had to give my office some name, and it's called the Cabana of Cruelty.
I love it. So what more perfect place for us to have a discussion about a crime novel. Now, in order to bridge the gap between tomorrow in Australia at 11 in the morning and this afternoon in Scottsdale, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I have with me a cup of tea. But Michael, in honor of you, my husband baked crumpets.
Oh, there you go.
So there it is, my lowly crumpet. I'm not going to try to eat it on screen, but I thought the least I could do was try to get into a suitably British mood. Even though you're in Australia, you are still writing novels with a background in the UK.
That's true. I mean, I was born and bred in Australia, but I lived in the UK for 12 years. That's where I was a journalist there for a long while, working for Fleet Street newspapers, and I was a ghostwriter there. So most of all my early publishing contacts, my agent and my publishers are all UK based, and now I've got American agents and the like. But yeah, so that's where my publishing career sort of took off. But I moved the family back to Australia about 20 years ago now, but I still set my books in the UK.
Indeed you do. I love your ghostwriting career. I actually looked up some things about Michael today, and I like the fact, here's what it says. In 1993, you quit journalism to become a ghostwriter, collaborating with politicians, pop stars, psychologists, adventurers, and show business personalities. 12 of these nonfiction titles were bestsellers with a combined sale of more than 2 million copies. And I'm pretty sure that you had to sign non-disclosure agreements, so we aren't going to know which ones you wrote.
Yeah, I could tell you a few of them, but I'd have to kill you if I told you others. But I'm probably the best known for a US audience, and I know we've probably got a bit of a global audience here. But I ghostwrote Jerry Halliwell's autobiography. She was Ginger Spice and the Spice Girls. And I was commissioned to write that just after she had fled the Spice Girls, and they were at that point the biggest band in the world, and the world seemed to want to answer the question, why had the band broken up, and so I grudgingly initially agreed to do that because I had a 6 and a 3-year-old daughter, and they had daughters, and they were driving me nuts listening to nothing but Spice Girls music. And I thought, really, do I want to go down that road? But no, it was an incredibly successful book, that one, around the world.
Did the London Olympics and I think it was the closing ceremony where they featured so many British music groups, and the Spice Girls, I remember, were part of it. Did that give a sort of added impetus to the whole thing, more of a global audience?
No, it was more, I think, because that sort of came after that. They sort of reunited for that Olympic Games sort of ceremony. But back in sort of I suppose around 2000, when they were at the height of their fame. I'm trying to remember, my daughter was born my eldest daughter was born in 1993. So probably about 2000. I mean, they were the biggest band in the world. I mean, but the generation now that are in their sort of late 20s, generation of people that are in their late 20s, the Spice Girls were the Beatles of their day. They were the biggest influence. And I mean, my eldest child is now a songwriter, producer, living in LA. And on the wall of the studio, there is Spice Girls paraphernalia, signed T-shirts and shirts by Jerry, because that's how influential Jerry was, Jerry Halliwell, and the Spice Girls were for Alex, and that's one of the reasons that Alex became a producer-songwriter.
It's interesting how these bands break up at the sort of, we've been watching the Peter Jackson Beatles, Let It Be. The middle one, I think, sags a bit, and we're saving up to watch the last 2.5 hours for the big finale. But, it's interesting to watch these personalities and how somehow they manage to fuse for the music, but individually they're, Ringo comes across as the most stable of them. And John is, so doped up the whole time. You can see he's just kind of in a trance. And Paul is really this driving force, and George is kind of resentful. And, and you think what it must be like for them, to all be sort of in a cluster. A lot of these bands break up like that. They have that dynamic.
Yeah, it's one of those things about, I mean, as a ghostwriter, I wrote 15 autobiographies for very famous people. And they're all very different, but one of the things you realize is that people to be that successful often have very big, strong personalities, very alpha personalities. And if you, in a band situation, when you get that clash between, I mean, often you need that energy, that creative energy, and conflict to actually push the band to the heights, but it's also the thing that ultimately will break them up. And the same thing happened in the Spice Girls. There were two, in particular in that band, there were two huge personalities that fought constantly, but they were also the two figures that drove that band to become, at that point, the biggest band in the world when they were at their height.
Makes you wonder what goes on with the Rolling Stones, which has somehow had at least two major personalities that have held together and miraculously have lived to be old. Considering,
that's true. Although it's interesting, it makes you wonder oftentimes with them, though. I mean, how much time they spend with each other outside of touring, and actually how much they like each other, or whether because with a lot of these people, a lot of these bands, they finish up not liking each other. They can still work together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to almost be married to them.
So we have, I guess the question would be, since this new book, which I really love, called When You Are Mine, it's our British Crime Book of the Month. And it's starting a new series. Am I right there?
Well, it was supposed to be a standalone, Barbara, but the reaction to the book has been so tremendous, and everyone keeps saying to me, "Are we going to see Philomena McCarthy again?" The lead character, and so there will be another Philomena book, not the next one, but maybe the one after. There'll be another book featuring Philomena.
Well, I certainly hope so, because there are actually a few threads in here that you can still pull. So it'd be a shame, I think, to leave it as a standalone. Yeah. But you have written one long running series with Joe McLaughlin. Tell us what's going on with Joe, because there's some interesting news that you've revealed recently.
Yeah, no, they've just finished shooting in the UK, in London and Liverpool, a 6-part TV series being made by World Productions, who are a very successful UK company who gave us shows like Line of Duty and The Bodyguard and The Bletchley Circle and some really big UK dramas. And they've shot, the first novel was called The Suspect. They've shot that. The lead actor playing the Joe O'Loughlin character is Aidan Turner, who is probably best known as the sexy dwarf in the Hobbit movies. He was the one that always got his shirt off, and also Poldark in the remake of a very successful UK series called Poldark. He plays the lead, Ross Poldark. And again, I have a feeling that he's far more handsome than I imagined Joe O'Loughlin would be. And I have a feeling they're probably going to write a scene in where he has to take his shirt off.
Well, why not? If you've got beefcake, you might as well exploit it.
But he's a very good actor. He's a very good actor. Yeah.
Now, I remember him very well from The Hobbit. And also, as you pointed out, I love the first Poldark. So I had a lot of trouble watching the second one. There was something about the first one that was truly magical. So
it's funny. I got to admit, I didn't watch the second series. But I did think when Aidan Turner was announced as being the Joe O'Loughlin character, I sort of thought, I sort of Googled him and realized that he is beefcake. You're absolutely right. He's also a very fine actor, but he's got something like 300 fan sites on social media. He is just, tabloid fodder and women's magazine fodder, particularly in the UK and Europe. So it's the sort of thing that will generate enormous amounts of publicity for the show, because he is just enormously sort of loved by the paparazzi and the general public. So hopefully that will mean we get a lot of eyeballs watching that series when it comes out, and it'll be later this year.
So, as we often have to say, as the Outlander bookstore, we don't actually have to say there are books. For the people who watch it, although I know Craig Johnson with the Longmire series, which, as you know, has an Australian called Robert Taylor as the lead, that people were astonished. Every once in a while, Craig would go somewhere and people would go, "Oh, there are books." As though, how could that be? So do you think, is that going to pressure you to write more books for Joe? Are you done with Joe, or are you still excited about Joe? What are you going to do with him in books?
Well, I think, as you know, with the Joe O'Loughlin, was a character, brilliant, the brilliant psychologist with a crumbling body was sort of I gave him early onset Parkinson's in that first book, never intending to write him as a series. I'd be an idiot to have done that. But he obviously, he struck a chord, and I did 7 or 8 books with Joe.
Right.
But I aged him in real time, and his disease progressively got worse. And so there was a limit to what I felt as though I could do with Joe. But saying that, when I left that series, his daughter Charlie had aged from the age of 8 and was now at university studying psychology. So I've given myself a possibility of spinning the series on with her, taking a lead role, and Joe perhaps mentoring her. She was studying psychology. And what I thought I might do, if the series is successful and they go on to make more, because the plan would be for them to make, the next book into a series as well. I thought it might be fun, maybe when the second series came out, to do a new Joe O'Loughlin book. By that stage, obviously, hopefully the character would be even better known because of the series, and it might be just the time to say, it will then have been about 5 or 6 years between the last book. So it'll be a bit of an event, hopefully.
Well, we are certainly well placed to discuss the effect of television series on books and book sales. But, thinking about Ian Rankin and Michael Connelly both did the same thing you did. They aged their characters in real time, and they've come up with interesting solutions. Michael has created a female, and so Bosch has now moved out of, active duty and is mentoring Renee Ballard as a policewoman. And Ian, in his last book, he's brought along Siobhan and other people all along. So, it's possible for you to do what you're suggesting. And there also, Michael, is the possibility of prequels before he was old and before he got sick.
Yeah. There are, although I think one of the points with Joe was that he wasn't, Joe was always a reluctant investigator. He wasn't like working with the police. He was a normal psychologist. He got dragged into these things. Right. And in that first book, it's the first time he'd ever been involved in anything. So a prequel would be quite hard for him. But I always loved I know Ian Rankin quite well, and I love Ian's rationale, because he retired John Rebus, because under Scottish law, detectives retired at the age of 60, and then and this is a true story. The Scottish Parliament debated increasing the age to 65, and one of the reasons given was that it would mean that Ian could write more Rebus books, which made a lot of detectives quite unhappy in Scotland because they were
I always
approaching.
love that story. It's really wonderful. I noticed, in fact, on the most recent Michael Connelly book, it says a Renee Ballard and Harry Bosch book. So, he's done that. So you have lots of opportunities. Now, in your career, you have won an astonishing number of awards. We are eventually going to talk about this book, but this is all background stuff here. So this gives me a chance to, because we often have an international audience for authors like Michael, to talk about the major awards that it's possible to win as a crime writer. So the first, since you started in the UK, the first ones would be the Gold Dagger. You've won it twice. And in fact, the book we last talked about was the one that won the Gold Dagger, right?
Possibly.
Or was it the book before?
It was Good Girl, Bad Girl won the, so the two that have won the daggers were Life and Death, and then Good Girl, Bad Girl won it about 2 or 3 years ago.
No, actually, it won it in 2020. Right.
Oh, did it? There you go.
Yep. It did. So I think that was our last conversation, and then you went on to win the Gold Dagger. But you've also been shortlisted. I'm trying to remember. Yep, you've been shortlisted for the Steel Dagger, which is the best thriller, as opposed to
I won the Steel Dagger last year with When She Was Good, which is the follow-up to Good Girl, Bad Girl. I haven't managed. I've been shortlisted for an Edgar, which is obviously the big, the two big, to my mind, the two big crime awards anywhere in the world are the Gold Daggers and the Edgars. Best Novel Awards, they're the absolute pinnacle. And as I said, I've managed to win the Gold Dagger twice, but I've been shortlisted twice for an Edgar, and never quite managed to get there. But I'm going to keep trying.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. Actually, one of the books you were shortlisted for the Steel Dagger for was The Night Fairy, which remains one of my all-time favorite of your books. It has such a killer surprise in it. Lord, I still remember how amazed I was. It was absolutely fabulous. But since you're in Australia, let's remind everybody there is something called the Ned Kelly Award for Best Novel, and that's also in crime fiction, and you've won that twice, as I understand it.
I have, yeah. I've won that twice.
So you're almost a trifecta. You just got to win an Edgar, and then you will
I think the thing with the Ned Kelly Awards, which is a wonderful award, but that's only eligible. You've got to be an Australian to sort of win that. Whereas the difference with the two big awards, the Edgars and the Daggers, is that it doesn't matter what nationality you are. It's just for what they regard as being the best crime novel of the year. It's not like a little national award, which is in no way does that downplay the Ned Kellys. I love that. I was chairman of the Australian Crime Writers Association for about 7 years, and I ran those awards, which is why for 7 years I never put my books forward for those awards, because it wasn't the right thing to do if you're part of the organization. But I think it's I love those awards, and I love supporting new crime writers.
Well, I think you've been very generous to other writers, and it's I think it's a hallmark actually of a not just a good writer, but a really nice guy, a good father, good husband, whatever it is, that you are generous to other people. Maybe now we will actually talk about this book that you've tuned in to watch tonight. So When You Were Mine introduces a new character named Philomena McCarthy. And she's a policewoman. So tell me about the fancy unit that she is part of in London. And does it relate to Line of Duty at all?
No, I must admit, I love that series, Line of Duty, but it's got that element. I mean, I'll give you the pitch, I suppose. Philomena McCarthy is a very young, ambitious, very new London police officer with the London Metropolitan Police, which is sort of like the New York City Police, but in London. And she's had to defy the odds, really, to become a policewoman, because she's from a family of gangsters or mobsters. I mean, the legendary McCarthy brothers have spent, her father and 3 uncles, 3 of the 4 have spent a long time in prison. So she's had to completely distance herself from her family to be allowed to join the London Metropolitan Police. But it always hangs in the background. And her family, her father in particular, she's an only child, would love to be able to draw her back into the fold. And so that's a sort of family dynamic. She's engaged to be married. she rescues a young woman from a domestic violence incident where this badly beaten young woman, and this woman has been beaten up by someone who turns out to be a decorated London detective. And I guess that's the seed of this story. And I guess the idea for the novel came from a documentary I saw on exactly that subject, how the police fail to investigate their own when it comes to domestic abuse, how often it's covered up, not investigated when the abuse involves a police officer having beaten up or abused their partner. And I suddenly thought to myself, is there a situation where you would be more helpless? Because the very people you would normally turn to help would be the police if you were being abused. And not only do they not help you, but because your partner has access to all of those wonderful computers and technology, your partner would know where the women's shelters are. He would know how to track your car. He would know how to find your phone. There's nowhere you could hide. There's no, and it's hard enough already if you're a survivor of domestic abuse to stay clear of violent partners. But if your partner is a police officer, it becomes almost impossible. And so that is sort of the setup that I wanted to create in this book.
Well, there's an additional problem because he's not just a police officer. He's a theoretically heroic police officer, which means that not only do they protect their own, but they really don't want this legend, to be tarnished in any way. So even if there's a real motive for a cover-up by the police, in the sense, they have something to lose. They have a stake in it too, I guess is what I want to say.
Yeah, and it's an interesting, occasionally it happens, and it's a trend where you write a book and then something happens in real life which mirrors what you've written, if you know what I mean. It's not something that you didn't write it after the event, you wrote it before. In the case of this book, there was a terrible murder that happened after the book was finished. A woman called Sarah Everhard was picked up walking home by a policeman, by a police officer, and murdered. And in the scandal that followed, it came out that there were many opportunities for the police to have identified this man as being a predator and to have kicked him out of the force, and that failed to happen. And it's sort of, I think one of the reasons the book has struck such a chord in the UK in particular was because it came out just at about the same time that the Sarah Everhard was murdered. And it's a tragedy but occasionally as a crime writer, you end up mirroring events that happen.
Well, you do. And, there's no way you can time a book. It takes so long for a book to be written and go through a production process and finally published. There's no way you can write towards anything like that. So it can only happen, as you say, that by chance you publish a book and it mirrors real life in some way. I've seen it happen so often over the years. Although, to be fair, occasionally, Michael, you can see an event and you say to yourself, somebody is going to write about this. An example of that would be the great flood that hit Chicago years ago. And I can remember in the aftermath of all the coverage and so forth, saying to myself, Sarah Paretsky is going to write this.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, it's funny. I remember thinking the same thing with Tin Roof Blowdown, James Lee Burke, and the Hurricane Katrina, and thinking. I remember thinking not necessarily that it would be James Lee Burke, but I thought someone is going to write a crime novel, and probably many novels, fiction would be written set around, that backdrop. And I guess we're all looking, even if we tell very small personal stories, if you have a big dramatic backdrop in which to tell a story, it gives it enormous sort of play with the reader.
Well, as you point out, your book mirrored something because of the confluence of time, which is different than if you use an historical event as a springboard, to write something. The immediacy, I think, lends a big punch to when people read it. And, people who don't know about the whole publishing process, I think often wonder if it's more like journalism than it is,
Yeah,
fiction.
no, it's true. And that's why, in the past, I know when I had a book, I think it was when Say You're Sorry came out. And it had been out for quite a while when there was a terrible story, uplifting in the sense that several women that had been held captive for 10 years managed to break free from where they were held. And I remember getting all this. I remember someone being attacked on social media that I had cashed in on that by writing a novel on a similar sort of subject. And my novel was written 3 years before they ever emerged. I had, but again, it's just in the reader's mind, they don't realize how long these things take. And you're not in any way would a crime writer cash in on anything. It's just sometimes you write something that happens to be mirrored in real life, and it's the nature.
Well, one of the gifts that you have as a novelist is writing characters, but oftentimes they turn out to be more surprising than we think they are. And unfortunately, we can't talk about all of the characters in this book because then the dreaded word spoiler comes into play. But I do think anybody who reads your books needs to be careful in assumptions about the characters that you're writing. So I guess a really interesting question would be, when you conceive them, do you think of them as, with all those possibilities, or do they develop them as you write them?
They develop as I write them. It's interesting because apart from, I guess, what you're alluding to is the other great theme of When You Were Mine. Obviously, domestic abuse is a hot button issue around the world, and so that's one theme. And police corruption and cover-ups, another. The other one is toxic friendships. This idea, and we've all had them. This idea that you befriend someone who just suddenly is incredibly helpful. And then in this case, without giving too much away, the Tempe Brown character, the woman that is rescued by Philomena from the domestic violence incident, they befriend, they become great friends, and Tempe begins to help Phil arrange a wedding. But there's something not quite right because Tempe, just clings, and it just becomes, it's almost like where you suddenly, as a reader, as you're reading, you're thinking, run, Phil, run, because you're sensing that there's something not quite right about, but, on the one hand, when you think having a friend that picks up all your dry cleaning for you and does all your chores for you, you think, how well, wouldn't it be great to have someone like that? And another little part of you is thinking, no, they're getting a little bit too close here. And so that's something I wanted to investigate in the book as well.
Do you think that women are more likely to have these kinds of friendships? They're in various British novels, you can find out that those kinds of things are with a personal assistant, or, for men, oftentimes it's a personal assistant or, a servant in the household or something. That the male thing doesn't seem to be friendship so much as it does, a person in charge and then the person underneath them. So
or you get, I guess it's a reflection, and obviously there are some very famous films on that idea of, with men it's normally a relationship. It's like that. It's the Fatal Attraction type story where the man has the one night stand, and it's the one night stand thinks it's more than a one night stand. It's that, and like men are obviously, and men and women are both. This whole idea of the stalking. This idea of people stalking a partner or an ex-partner, or even just someone that they become infatuated with, a famous person. That you have those elements as well. But I think with friendships, it is more women. I think with relationships, it can be often involve, when men are involved, it's more potentially that there's been a relationship and that's either broken down or someone wants more than the other person from the relationship. I do know when I was writing When You Were Mine, I wanted to create, it has a sort of, this is not giving too much away, but it has that sort of ending, that morally ambiguous ending where you debate afterwards whether you think, who you think was right or wrong. And there are sort of, I wanted to sort of, there are endings of books like Mystic River by Dennis Lehane, with certain events in Mystic River, and also Presumed Innocent by Scott Turow, where when you get to the ending, you sort of think, Did the real, who was the real bad person there? Did the right person suffer? Or then morally, I wanted to have an ending where people would go, wow, I really want to talk to someone about that ending. And we can't, but
no, we can't. But actually, I did have we launched Scott Turow's last book, and one of the things we talked about was presumed innocent. And I told him that I can remember people would stand at the checkout counter back in the days when I actually was the checkout counter at the Poison Pen before it got a little bigger than that, and would argue about, who did it. And I said to Scott, we think of Gone Girl as, as the kickoff for the Trust No One genre and all, but actually Presumed Innocent was,
I agree.
was really that book.
Yeah, that idea of, I think Scott Turow did that unreliable narrator brilliantly. Yep. And that to me he was the one that really showed how powerful it could be. As you say, later with books like Gone Girl or Girl on a Train, it's been used a lot of late, probably over the last sort of 5 to 10 years. But to me, Presumed Innocent is still one of the finest examples, because I remember getting halfway through that book and thinking, oh my God, he must have done it. He must have done it. He must, and thinking, how can he narrate this and be the killer? How can he do that? Yeah, it's brilliantly done.
Well, I could take you all the way back to what is really the first one that I have ever read. I will take you back to Cyril Hare in A Tragedy at Law, because that was, in fact, the first unreliable narrator that I can recall, and that was written in the 1930s, way before.
I haven't read that. I'll have to go.
Oh, Michael, it's one of the really great books, honestly. He was an Oxford Don who wrote, he was another one of the, no, he was the sitting judge. That's right. He was the sitting judge. And, he was still, I love this, he was still writing circuit in the 1930s, preceded by trumpeters.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's Francis Pettigrew is the name of the main character. But if you've never read A Tragedy at Law, I cannot recommend it to you highly enough. He keeps turning up in classics. And in fact, one of the great things about the pandemic is that it's really encouraged people to read classics. I mean, there is an astonishing audience every week when I do the restock report at the bookstore. I am blown away by the vast number of classics that we sold in the past week, not just in crime, but all kinds of stuff. And so we've now expanded to this big classic section that previously might have just been like one little bookshelf. Martin Edwards has done a great job with the British Library crime classics, reminding people not the pinnacle like Christie and Sayers and Allingham, but a lot of really fine writers who wrote in that period. And I love it because there are so many wonderful conventions and structures for crime fiction, and you can really appreciate modern writers playing with it if you've read the originals. And then there were none. The Agatha Christie's had this huge rebirth, of people using that design. And it's more fun if you actually ever read, and then there were none, despite its
it's funny. I was once famously misquoted, I should say, when my first novel, The Suspect, came out. I was interviewed, and the headline in the story afterward was, I was a crime writer who had only ever read one crime novel. And what I'd sort of said at the time was, unlike, you've interviewed so many people that would have talk about being absolutely schooled in the genre. They grew up reading crime, they read crime, under the covers by torchlight. And I wasn't like that at all. When I said I'd read more than one, but I'd sort of read one Agatha Christie and one Conan Doyle and one Ian Rankin. But because as a reader, and when I wrote that first book, I didn't know it was a crime novel. So one of the reasons I still, to this day, I've read a lot more now. I sort of think I don't read as many as other people, is because I'm scared of being influenced by them. And on the one hand, you're right, people should be influenced by them because there's some great writers of the past. But another part of me is, I know if I read too much James Lee Burke, I begin trying to write like a really poor man's version of James Lee Burke, and I think, okay, let's not read any more James Lee Burke while I'm writing.
Well, I think we have to distinguish here between readers and writers.
Yes.
Readers can afford to indulge themselves. And I'm glad you mentioned Christie, because in that progression, with the tragedy of Law and Presumed Innocent, I should have put in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, right?
Yeah, which is
Yep.
very,
There we
definitely.
are. So talk to me a little bit about names, because you have, you've got interesting names in this book. Philomena's not your garden variety name. Tempe Brown is an interesting name. Even the decorated cop, who is a real shit, I might say. What's his name?
Darren Goodall, is it? No.
Yeah. So, do you put a lot of energy into names, coming up with the right name for the character, or what you feel is the right name for the character?
Yeah, look, I've got to, it has to feel right. I mean, I've always loved, and you can sort of see it with when I name my children. I love girls' names that can be shortened to boys' names. Like in terms of, Charlotte gets Charlie, or Philomena gets Phil, and I don't know why that is, but I just have that. I just like that. And, Frederica gets Fred, or whatever. But I guess what I'm looking for is, I'm just looking for a name. And maybe this is a fallback to having read a lot of Scandinavian or Nordic crime, where sometimes when the names are so unpronounceable, I find it really hard to remember them. Do you know what I mean? I find it really, and so you want a name that's memorable, but also not a name that's so unusual that people struggle to actually, when they're trying to tell a friend about this book, it's got this character and they think, well, I can't pronounce their name, but this, so yeah, I just look for that. But you're right about, they live and breathe in your mind, because I remember very early on in my career, I was pointed out by an editor that I had too many names starting with J. Like every character seemed to have a name with either Joe or Jock or Julianne, or like there's just J's. And they said, you should change them. There's too many J's. And I really couldn't, because by that point, these characters were their name. And I couldn't just blithely give them a new one. It just didn't work in my head.
Well, you do have to be careful in any one novel that you don't have like two people named James, or, because otherwise the reader's never going to remember who it is that's speaking, or the rest of it. But I suppose in a universe of books that you could have, J names. And then, we all have freighted, I don't know why, but I think each one of us has names that have some sort of association that makes the name unpleasant for us. I mean, I won't.
Oh, that's true.
I won't speak out on a couple of mine, but there's this sort of automatic aversion, if I run across a character in a novel with this particular name. And then, recently we have these stupid tropes like, Karen has, become kind of a buzzword. And, I think that's a shame to appropriate a perfectly nice name and turn it into some sort of a trope.
But it's like, when my children were being born, there's a name that, we're discussing names, and suddenly, my wife will mention a name and I go, oh no, I had a really terrible girlfriend who was called that. So we always associate people with that, I mean, I auction names, normally won a book for charity. And I know when Joe O'Loughlin books were, what a lot of writers do, as you know, and with the Joe O'Loughlin books, Parkinson was Parkinson's charities sort of always. And when you do that, you just sit there and have everything, all your fingers crossed, saying that please don't have a name like Ronald Reagan or like Michael Jackson. You don't want them having a name that's incredibly, common or famous, and then you don't want them having a name that's completely unpronounceable. And so you're just sort of going, please give me a good name.
I can see that. Now, does the character come to life for you when you assign them a name? I mean, which goes first? Do you think of a character and then come up with a name, or do you find a name and then that sort of begins to sketch the character for you?
The voice comes first. I mean, I write, as you know, a lot on the first person, and to me, and I ghost wrote obviously in the first person when I wrote books for people like Jerry Halliwell. I did Lulu, the 60s pop star Lulu. They've got unique voices, so when you write their autobiography, you have to sound like them. You have to recreate their voice. And when I write fiction, it's the same. And I remember when I first wrote Joe O'Loughlin, and I gave him early onset Parkinson's, I can remember the moment I captured his voice. I wrote a paragraph where Joe says, when I get out of bed every morning, I know if it's going to be a good day or a bad day if I can bend down and tie my shoes. And I just thought, that's his voice, that slightly self-deprecating sense of that's his voice. And once I had his voice, that's what makes the character come to life. To a sense, I could call them anything after that, but as long as I have their voice in my head, and I think I'm inside their head, that's what comes first.
Joe's a good name. It's kind of an ordinary Joe, as we would say, but Philomena is not an ordinary name. So, it made me wonder if you wanted to, that you saw her as extraordinary, or you want her to be extraordinary, and the name is part of that whole personality.
Yeah, I mean, I do want it to be. I mean, I'm not a huge lover of slogans, but if I had sort of 3 words that I put above my desk, it would be make them care, in terms of and what I mean by that is that I want to create a character that the reader cares about and wants to go on this journey with. And with Philomena, it's a memorable name, and but I think it's more a case of, you can have a memorable name, but if you don't make her memorable as a character, if you don't give her a wonderful sense of humanity or humor, or then people won't want to go. I mean, or talking about going back to something like unreliable narrators. I'm in awe of Gillian Flynn with Gone Girl, because neither of the 2 main characters in that, Amy or Nick, are likable. I mean, you dislike them both, and yet it's one of the most compelling books you'll ever read. And that takes a really genius piece of writing. In my case, I think I need to create a character that people fall in love with and want to. And then even the most horrible thing that happens, they're there with them. They're saying, please, please, you must endure. You must get through this.
I find it difficult. There are very few books that I really bond with if there's not one person in it to like.
Exactly.
And, one of the things I don't really like about this whole trust no one wave that I keep hoping is receding is that very often that's what you wind up getting, is, a whole series of unlikable characters, and it's hard to root for them. But then some of the most successful books that we know are like that. So
yeah, and no, you're right. I mean, when you look at, I think again, Patricia Highsmith, Ripley is one of the classic examples of psychopath, and yet where they're wanting Ripley to get away with it. It's a genius piece of writing. But and look, there are certain shows, like most recently White Lotus, which I don't know whether you've seen the series White Lotus, but there's not a single character in that is in any way likable, and yet it is compelling watching. Succession, another very big series of late on TV, or streaming. Again, all of them are loathsome people, but I think a good enough writer can make it work, perhaps. I don't know if I'm there, but I think I've got to make my characters. There's got to be someone in it that you want to root for and to win.
Well, if you're a reader, you want different experiences and different kinds of books. You don't want to read, well, that's true of me anyway. I shouldn't say if you're a reader, but because some people like to read the same book, same sort of book over and over again, but I like the different experiences. Talk to me just a little bit about structure before we summon up Patrick for questions. Most of your books have really been investigatory in their, police procedurals by their very nature are, but even Joe.
They're not
that way.
Yeah, they're not. It's funny. I avoid it very rarely. I don't call them police procedures because mainly I've never had a policeman, or I think only once have I had a policeman as the main character. Vincent Ruiz did a book where he was at the, and I think this is what sort of Michael Connolly discovered at times, that if you put your character in the middle of the police force, then there are great rules and regulations about investigating. In the UK, it's called the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, about what you can and can't do. Whereas, of course you can have your rogue policeman that, decides to, I'm going to kick down that door. I'm not going to wait for the warrant type thing. But normally there's great strictures on the police, whereas having a psychologist as your main character made it much sort of easier to operate outside that sphere. Philomena is interesting because even though she is a policewoman, it's not an investigation as such. She's actually just independently trying to protect to protect Tempe and protect herself. And off the books, she's investigating this violent police officer, trying to see if there's some way, because he's trying to destroy her career and she's trying to save her career. And it's sort of, so it's not, you wouldn't say it's a classic police procedural. There's not a crime that she's trying to, some killer out there that she's trying to.
No, but it still has a structure that moves, along.
Yeah, I mean, I think
there's a mission involved, which is
no, it's also, I mean, very much. I mean, that classic, it's got that classic storytelling. I mean, all great story needs conflict, but it also needs someone must want something and something has to stand in their way. Right. And so it's got all of those drivers there. And I mean, structurally with me, and this is a book, it's sort of an example. I don't plot the books in advance. So I have no idea how the book's going to end when I begin. And sometimes I think that shows, because the book sort of sometimes drifts onto places you don't know it's going to go. And that's because that's where my mind took me. As long as I can drag it back, that's, and I remember when I was writing When You Were Mine, getting to a point thinking, I don't know how to end this book. I don't know how, I don't know how it's going to end. And panicking that for the first time I was going to not come up with an ending. But in the end, I was really happy, because I think I came up with an ending that most people won't see coming.
I liked your ending very much, but I also think, the fact that you trained as a journalist and you wrote, you did your ghostwriting and all, gives you a platform and a confidence that, journalism training, I think, is a huge help in writing, especially crime novels, because you're trained to think along the lines of how does the story go, here's where it starts. Well, I think, how do we get to where we're going?
And we're good at meeting deadlines. And I think it's true, it's a lot of most journalists that I worked with in my career wanted to be writers. A lot of them did. A lot of, and like people like Michael Connelly is a former journalist, obviously. I mean, so many, Laura Lippman, I mean, there are so many that came out of journalism. But a lot that don't, because a lot of those journalists discover that there's a great energy in writing a different story every day as a journalist. And the thought of sitting down for 12 months and working on a single project is something they just couldn't sort of focus on. They have to be doing something new and different and exciting all the time. And so on the one hand, you're absolutely right. Journalism is a tremendous career to come out of, to become a crime writer. But on the other hand, it takes a lot of discipline to sit down and work on a single project and not be distracted.
Absolutely. But I also think journalists are receptive to editing because they've been edited. And, part of that process does involve editing. And let me see, Patrick, do come and join us. But I did want to say that, in regard to your comment about police procedurals and how they have to work within the confines of what cops are allowed to do, I've often thought that's one reason why private eye novels are so fabulous, because, they get to behave
they're
like
outside,
but not like, we've just been watching the CB strike, the J.K. Rowling writing as Robert Galbraith. And, he's an interesting character. He's different than the guy in the book in many ways, but, they can break bounds and do things that you can't do as a cop. You can't take your credit card and, break into the
it's true. It's true. And that's why a lot of people, and even, Michael Connelly did it with Bosch at times,
right.
Had him out of the police force, had him thrown out so he could actually do a few novels with Bosch not having those restrictions.
Right. And your psychologist is not that different than a private eye. He has a particular expertise, and he also has a client, which is why, that it's almost like the classic Western structure, where does your loyalty lie? And with a private eye, in theory, it's really to your client. Patrick, are you there, or have I discouraged you from popping in by
maybe there are no questions?
No, I'm here. I was waiting for the opportune moment.
All right.
There is a question. You've discussed this a little bit, but Geraldine wants to know, can you tell us more about your time as a police reporter?
I got a feeling I know who this Geraldine might be. It may be, I might be wrong, maybe the wonderful Geraldine Brooks, who was an incredibly fine novelist. I began my journalism career as a cadet on an Australian newspaper, and part of that was as a police rounds person. That's where you listen to police, ambulance, and fire radios. This goes back to what you were saying, Barbara, about journalists having a background where they have a lot of information at their fingertips, because that was pretty much the paper I worked for. The bread and butter stories that paper survived on were court stories and police rounds. So it was a lot of chasing of police cars, ambulances, and fire engines, and we monitored the frequencies of all of those services. And often we would jump in a car and turn up and go to these scenes. And there are times when I've been to crime scenes before and got there before the police, because we were closer than they were. And you see a lot of tragedy. You see you see a lot of grief. It's one of those things. I think it was one. I can remember the moment where I think I spent most of my early career when I was doing police rounds, almost imagining that this was just a drama in front of me, that that wasn't a real person that was in that wrecked car, or that wasn't a real person that had jumped off that cliff. And it was only about 4 years in that I went to an accident scene where a man was pinned into a truck by an accident, and he was talking to me. They were waiting for the jaws of life to be able to move the metal to be able to pull him out. And I was moved away by a fire officer to move back from the scene, and that truck burst into flames, and that driver who perished in the truck. And because I talked to him, because he talked about, oh, my wife's going to kill me, I'm going to be late home tonight. I'd made that connection. I remember being completely traumatized by that event, because for the first time I suddenly, I couldn't just say that this was sort of like this was drama. This wasn't real. These were real people. And so much of what I write is informed by my career as a journalist, and when it comes to police rounds, particularly working nights, the only people you're hanging out with detectives who are working nights, and with the pimps and the prostitutes and the drug dealers and the druggies, and they are the people that you tend to spending a lot of your time with. And I learned a tremendous amount and saw a lot of life.
If that actually is Geraldine Brooks, can I give a shout out and say how fabulous a writer I think you are? And we've really enjoyed selling your books. And once upon a time, you actually signed one of your books for us, which I've always been grateful for.
Absolutely.
And if you're not that Geraldine Brooks,
I know.
if you're saying Geraldine. Something anyway.
Another question from my good friend Stepan Vlahovic. He wants to know any thoughts of work set in Australia.
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, because obviously being Australian, and a lot of people in Australia for many years thought I was English, and would ask me, I'd turn up at events and they'd say, how long are you here for? Imagining that I was sort of heading back to London at any moment. And look, I will. I have, I love telling the story that in my bottom drawer, I have the greatest ever unpublished Australian novel. It was a book that I wrote in 1985, and it was almost published by Penguin in the UK, and it missed out by a single vote in a publishing meeting. And I asked afterwards, why didn't you publish it? And they said, well, if you had set that story in England, Ireland, Scotland, or Wales, because this was a book set in Australia, so we would have published it in a heartbeat. But because you set it in Australia, it's just too hard for us to try to sell. And the world's moved on a lot since 1985, as we know. Where people are reading books set all over the world, but that was at an era where pretty much the Brits would read British crime and the Americans would read American crime, and you didn't get much sort of crossover or international fiction. And so that book is still in my bottom drawer. And now I obviously get asked by publishers all the time to pull it out. But and maybe I will one day. Although while it remains in my bottom drawer, it will still be the Australian's greatest ever unpublished novel. But the moment I take it out, then clearly that's going to end.
Is that your first novel, Michael?
That is my first novel, yeah. And so I'm waiting for the idea, really. I'm waiting, and it may well be that's the book that I rewrite. I mean, because I wrote it when I was sort of 25, so it's a lot of years ago. It may well be that one that I rewrite. But I'm waiting for the idea, really. I'm waiting for the idea that I think it would be perfect for an Australian setting.
Let's see, anything else? There are a couple of questions that have come in a looks to be Russian language that I can't translate, but I won't guess what they are, but let's see. That's about it, Barbara. It's a quiet group.
If I'm not squelching anybody, let me say that one of the great things I have found over the last couple of years with Zoom is that we've been able to connect with authors all over the world. The most challenging, Michael, you'll appreciate this, is that I conceived the idea of putting two Irish authors together, completely forgetting the fact that one lived in Dublin, I'm in Scottsdale, and the other lives in Perth. And to try to work out the time zones for that one was really, really challenging. But we've been all over. We've been in Sweden, we've been in France, we've been all over Australia, New Zealand. We're doing an event for the First Lady of Iceland on February 19th, which, none of these opportunities really would have been ours without Zoom. And I think that as a result, there's a lot more interest, at least in our customers, in international crime. But even without that, and before then, and maybe the Scandinavian thing really kicked it off, but I'm finding more and more books published in the United States are actually written by authors in other countries, and people really like them. And, I think Australian crime is actually making serious headwind into
no, I think we talk sort of outback noir, but it's no, I think in Australia, as I said, being involved in the Crime Writers Association for so long, we were all sort of hoping that the next wave wouldn't, after Nordic noir, would be sort of outback noir or Antipodean noir. But no, you're right. I think the beauty is that readers and now, I mean, that's the beauty of being a reader. You can be transported into any part of the world, and it's what has sort of meant that, I know from my point of view in Australia, someone like Jane Harper. I mean, I was told this was a sad thing. About 10 years ago, I was told by a very senior international publisher that they would be happy if I wrote a book set anywhere in the world except Australia, because they said there was no Australian crime novel in modern times that had ever had really big international success. And I remember saying at the time, yes, but that is until there is one. Right. And of course, Jane Harper of The Dry had such a massive international hit with that book, and just proved that he was wrong. And now I think there's a lot of Australian writers now who are making great inroads overseas and
absolutely. I published one, as you know, Sir Larry Gentle, who I think writes fabulous books. And, I'm really excited. We've talked to Jane recently this year. In fact, Sir Larry and I are doing a conversation on January 18th. And hers are not outback at all. I mean, hers are.
No, that's right.
So it's absolutely wonderful. Well, thank you, Michael, for sharing time. You've always been one of my favorite writers, and I wish that we had gotten to see you in the flesh more frequently.
Next time. Well, as I said, I now have a child who lives in, full time in America. So I'm going to have to get across there more often. And next time we'll have to do it in person at Poison Pen.
Well, I certainly hope you were. I'll talk to Sydney about it. We actually have a nonprofit arm of the Poison Pen, which we collect money from readers. And also I do some freelance editing, and I put all my editor's fees into it and so forth. And part of it, I think we may end up using for plane fare for, international writers who might not otherwise be able to come to the States, but can come here. And since we have this great platform that so many thousands of people watch, one appearance at the Poison Pen could equal basically a book tour.
Oh, no, I'd love it. I mean, as I say, well, I tend to be back, and I'm sure I'll be there anyway at some point, because, as I say, family, you've got to, I mean, we had not seen Alex for 2 years, and Alex came home for Christmas. So, but we'll get back to America soon.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Michael. It's always a treat.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Patrick.
Let me just remind you how wonderful this book is, When You Are Mine. And don't be discouraged by the fact that our website says we're sold out, because I'm going to fix that tomorrow. We will have more copies. So thank you all very much for joining us. If you have a chance, stick around for about a half hour, and we're going to talk to a debut novelist, and he's writing about an Irish character in World War II. And that's an aspect of the war. I don't know that we read about German, we read about American, we read about British and all, but I don't know that we've read a lot of stories where the Irish are, involved so much in the war. So Patrick, being our resident Celt, is going to be, I hope, the engine of this program, but we'll see how
Excellent.
it goes. Right. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great evening, guys.
Enjoy,
Thank you.
everybody. Good
Thank
night.
you.